Welcome back to the channel. Today's story takes us into the heart of galactic politics, where dozens of ancient civilizations gather to judge a species they believe is weak, insignificant, and easily controlled. What follows is not a battle, but a moment of realization. One ship, one person, and one calm walk across a chamber that changes the balance of power in the entire galaxy. Stay with us until the end, because this story proves that true strength doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it simply arrives and lets silence do the talking. This story teaches us that real power is not loud, reckless, or desperate. It is calm, deliberate, and self-aware. Humanity did not demand respect through threats or destruction. Instead, they demonstrated confidence, restraint, and absolute control, showing that they could dominate the galaxy, but chose not to. It also reminds us that underestimating others is often the first step toward losing everything. The Conclave judged humanity by appearances, short lifespans, soft bodies, and limited numbers. What they failed to see was a species forged by hardship, driven by fear, and strengthened by relentless perseverance. At its core, the story tells us that fear is not humanity's weakness, it is their fuel. Humans don't eliminate fear. They carry it with them and move forward anyway. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing in the universe is not a colossal warship, but a single individual who walks into a room full of enemies and refuses to be afraid. For the first time in over a century, the Grand Deliberation Chamber was absolutely packed. Every single seat, pod, and platform was taken. Imagine a gigantic hall carved into the heart of an asteroid, filled with delegates from 34 different spacefaring civilizations, all chattering away. The noise was like a living ocean, and in the middle of it all, one species was about to be judged, a species that didn't stand a chance. Stick around, because you're not going to believe what happens next. Floating near the front in his personal fluid pod was Ambassador Tolk Von. Tolk was a Veori, a species that lives its whole life floating in a warm, thick liquid that feeds them through their see-through skin. His body was gently glowing, with soft waves of green and blue light pulsing across his chest as he took in data. He'd spent 3 straight weeks getting ready for this meeting, and he still felt a knot of anxiety. The reason was simple. Today, the Galactic Conclave was voting on whether to admit a new species. Now, this wasn't totally unheard of. New species applied every couple of decades. Most got rejected flat out. A few were let in as junior observers. They could watch, but they couldn't vote. And once in a blue moon, a species got provisional status, basically a trial period that could last for centuries. But this species, they were different. Not because they were strong or ancient. In fact, by all the standards the Conclave used, they were completely and utterly boring. They called themselves humans. Tolk shifted in his pod and glanced around the chamber. Over to his left, the Cerevi delegation stood on a platform built to hold their massive, armored bodies. The Cerevi were giant insect-like creatures, each one standing nearly 10 feet tall, with a tough exoskeleton the color of dried blood. Their huge compound eyes shattered the light into hundreds of reflections, and their mandibles never stopped clicking, a sound that made most other species deeply uncomfortable. The head of their delegation, a huge female named Vray, sat in the middle of her group with her 4 arms crossed over her chest. To Tolk's right, the Draal stood perfectly still, as always. The Draal were the oldest members of the Conclave, massive beings whose bodies seemed to be made of living stone. They were easily over 13 feet tall and moved with a slowness that many mistook for stupidity. Nobody ever made that mistake twice. The Draal were incredibly patient, brilliant, and when they finally decided to act, they could end wars. Their group was just 3 of them. They hadn't said a word in an open session in more than 60 years, The buzz in the room died down as the moderator, a small, six-limbed creature from the Pilani species, made its way to the central podium and switched on the translation system. Every word from that podium would be instantly beamed into the minds and ears of every delegate. "Delegates of the Galactic Conclave," the moderator began, its voice thin but loud enough to fill the entire hall. "We are here to discuss the official admission request of the species known as Homo sapiens, or as they call themselves, humans, from the Sol system in the outer part of the Orion Arm." A low murmur went through the crowd. The Orion Arm was considered the galactic boondocks, a boring stretch of space that had never produced anything interesting. "I now give the floor to Ambassador Tolk Vaughn of the Veori Collective, who has put together the official report on the applicants." Tolk's pod floated forward until he was next to the podium. A hologram lit up all around him, filling the air with charts and images. He took a slow breath of his nutrient fluid and started. "Fellow delegates, the species we're discussing evolved on a single planet, the third from their star, which is a pretty average yellow dwarf. The planet itself is classified as a Category 7 death world." That got a reaction. Death worlds were planets with violent volcanoes, insane weather, and deadly animals. Most intelligent life came from calm, stable planets. A Category 7 was barely considered livable. "Their biology is carbon-based," Tolk went on. "They walk on two legs and are usually between 1.5 and 2 meters tall. They have no natural armor, no venom, no special healing abilities, and absolutely no psychic powers. Even with their latest medical tech, they barely live past 200 standard years." The Saravi Hive speaker made a sound that could only be insect laughter. Her mandibles clicked together loudly. 200 years? She boomed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My egg layers live longer than that!" A wave of chuckles spread through the chamber. The Veori delegates' bodies flashed with amused colors. Even the most serious species couldn't help but make quiet sounds of disbelief. Tolk just waited for it to quiet down. He didn't find it funny at all. Something in the report was bugging him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Their technology has developed very quickly," he said, trying to regain control. "They figured out faster-than-light travel about 40 standard years ago. Since then, they've spread to 17 star systems." 17 systems in 40 years? Interrupted a delegate from the Morith Communion, a tall, skinny being with skin like polished silver. "That's incredibly aggressive." "It's not unheard of," Tolk replied cautiously. "The Saravi colonized 23 systems in their first 50 years. "Yes," Vrey shot back, her compound eyes gleaming. "And we had the military might to back it up. What do these humans have? Soft skin and short lives." More laughter. Tolk just moved on to the next part of his report. "Information on their military is limited. The humans have not been very open about their defensive forces. What we know mostly comes from long-range scans and stray communications we've picked up." He paused. The hologram shifted to show a few blurry pictures of human territory. They showed shipyards and space stations, but nothing looked particularly impressive or threatening. "Based on our analysis," Tolk said, "their navy seems pretty small. We guess they have around 300 ships, mostly medium-sized cruisers and light carriers. Their weapons look like basic energy and projectile types, probably on par with technology we were using 2 centuries ago." You could feel the entire chamber relax. 300 ships was a joke. The Conclave's combined fleet had over 12,000 warships, not even counting the Draal's legendary stone leviathans, the most powerful ships in the galaxy. "To sum up," Tolk said, "humanity appears to be a young, biologically weak species with a tiny military and an aggressive but manageable expansion. They have formally requested to join the Conclave and have told us they are sending a delegation to our headquarters." He paused for a second. "I should add one last thing. The humans didn't exactly request to come. They informed us they were on their way." This was met with a moment of stunned silence, then a wave of dismissive hisses and clicks. The Seravi Hive speaker waved one of her forearms. The arrogance of children. They'll learn their place. The moderator then opened the floor for comments. Most delegates just repeated the same thing. Humanity was a joke. Their nerve was kind of funny, but they should be admitted as junior observers at best, just to keep an eye on them. One delegate even suggested turning them away completely to teach them a lesson in respect. But through all the chatter, one delegate sat perfectly silent. Lazison Iron SVC of the Nethari sat near the back, his long fingers pressed together in front of his face. The Nethari were a species of master diplomats. They lived for over 1,000 years and survived by understanding other species better than those species understood themselves. Irene had been in his position for 300 years, and he'd developed a keen instinct for danger that had nothing to do with fleets or weapons. Something about this whole situation just felt wrong. He had read the report far more carefully than the others. He saw things they had missed. That expansion rate, for example, 17 systems in 40 years, wasn't just aggressive, it was calculated. The humans hadn't just spread out randomly. They had taken resource-rich systems, set up defenses at strategic choke points, and built complex supply lines connecting every single colony. That wasn't the work of a young species just stumbling into space. That was the work of a species that had studied the galactic map and planned every single move before they even started. And then there was the intelligence report itself. Tolk had admitted their information was limited. But Iron knew the difference between a species that was hard to spy on and a species that was actively blocking you from spying on them. Those blurry photos, the intercepted messages that were full of useless chatter, the complete lack of any real data on their best weapons. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. It wasn't that the Conclave couldn't find the information. It was that the humans didn't want them to. This just wasn't the kind of data you'd see from a primitive species. No, this was the work of a civilization that knew exactly what the conquered were looking for and had gone to great lengths to make sure they'd never find it. Irin raised his hand. The moderator gave him a nod. "I have a question for Ambassador Vron," he said. His voice was soft, in the typical Nethari way, but the translation tech made sure it carried perfectly. Tolki turned to face him. "Of course, liaison. You mentioned the humans announced they're sending a delegation. Did they give any details? How many ships? What kind?" Tolk glanced at his data slate. "They provided no details on the composition of their delegation. They only said they would be here at the Nexus within 10 standard days. And we have nothing? No intelligence on what they might be sending?" "No, our ability to observe their core systems is limited." Irin gave a slow nod. "Thank you, Ambassador." He said nothing else, but that uneasy feeling in his gut just wouldn't go away. The meeting dragged on for another 2 hours before the council finally voted on how to greet the human delegation. The outcome was exactly what you'd expect. The humans would get a welcome, all right, a proper welcome, which in the language of the conquered meant they were about to be reminded of who was in charge. The decision was simple: a show of force. A massive fleet, drawn from multiple species, would be arranged in a grand formation around the Nexus station, impossible for any approaching ship to miss. It was a classic move, used whenever a new species showed up. It was a way of saying welcome to the club, and don't get any ideas, all in one breath. Over the next few days, warships from every corner of conquered space started pouring in. The Krevi sent a battle swarm of 40 fast-attack ships, their hulls covered in bristling plasma cannons. The Valori showed up with a dozen of their bio-organic cruisers, living ships that could literally heal themselves and adapt to enemy weapons on the fly. The Morith Communion dispatched their flagship, a gorgeous, sleek vessel that could create gravity wells strong enough to trap enemy ships. And then, the Dra'al sent the Stone Leviathan. As always, it was the last to arrive. The Stone Leviathan was 4 kilometers long, a colossal slab of engineered rock and metal that had been the single most feared warship in the galaxy for over 3,000 years. Its weapons could crack a planet's crust. Its shields could take the combined fire of an entire fleet. In all of its long history, it had never once been defeated. It had never even been seriously scratched. This incredible fleet arranged itself into a crescent, facing the direction where the humans were expected to appear. Over 100 warships, representing the total military might of the galaxy's greatest civilizations, hung there in the blackness of space like a glittering wall of death. On the observation decks of the Nexus station, delegates from all over gathered to watch the show. The atmosphere was like a party. Drinks were being passed around. People were placing bets on how big the human fleet would be. The Sci-Fi were betting big that the humans would bring at least 20 ships, just to try and look tough. The Velori figured 10 was a more realistic number. The Morith delegate wagered a mere 5, guessing that the humans seemed to prefer being efficient over being flashy. Irin Svik stood by himself at a viewport, far from the crowd. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't betting. He just watched the stars and waited. On the 8th day, the long-range sensors picked something up. A single signature coming from human space, moving faster than light. One contact. Just one. The sensor operators relayed the news to the fleet commanders, who then told the delegates. The reaction was instant, and it was pure amusement. One ship. The humans were actually sending a single ship to face the combined power of the entire galactic Concord. The Sci-Fi hive speaker laughed so hard her mandibles clicked together. "One ship!" she shrieked. "They send one ship! I guess they couldn't afford a second one." Even the Velori, who were usually calm and reserved, began pulsing with bright, amused colors. The mood on the observation deck turned absolutely giddy. This was going to be even more pathetic than they'd imagined. The little upstart species was sending one small vessel, probably their fanciest cruiser, hoping it would be enough to impress them. Irin didn't laugh. He just stared at the sensor display, watching that one tiny dot get closer, and the knot in his stomach tightened. One ship. Why would a species that had so carefully locked down 17 star systems, a species that had hidden its military power from the best intelligence network in the galaxy, a species that had told them they were coming, not asked for permission, why would they send just one ship? Unless one ship was all they needed. The dot on the screen grew larger. The fleet tightened its crescent formation, their weapon systems humming on standby. The observation decks were now packed to capacity. Every delegate that could be there was there. Nobody wanted to miss the look on the humans' faces when they realized what they had just flown into. Irin Svik pressed his long fingers against the cold glass of the viewport, his eyes fixed on the empty patch of space where the human ship would appear. The stars were silent. The fleet was waiting. The galaxy was on the verge of changing forever, and none of them had a clue. The sensor contact was 3 minutes out. A single warship in the Concord fleet had its scanners locked on the exact same point in space, a patch of total darkness about 200 kilometers ahead of their formation. The math said that's where the human ship would drop out of hyperspace. On the bridge of the Drawal's stone Leviathan, the command crew stood at their posts in absolute silence. The Drawal never spoke while on duty. They communicated through tiny vibrations in the stone floor, so faint that no other species could even feel them. The ship's commander, a being named Kordath, stood at the forward viewport, his eyes like polished granite fixed on the blackness. He had been in command of the Leviathan for 600 years. He'd fought in 11 major battles and had never lost. He wasn't scared of one little human ship, but he was paying attention. The Drawal always paid attention. Back on the Nexus station, the observation decks were overflowing. Delegates were packed shoulder to shoulder, hovering in anti-grav pods, or clinging to the walls with sticky limbs, all of them staring out the massive viewports at the waiting fleet. The Karevi had brought snacks and were eating loudly, treating the whole thing like a holiday festival. The Velori had dimmed their natural bioluminescence in anticipation, their bodies dark except for a few nervous flickers of light. Liaison Irin Svik had found a quiet spot near the top of the main deck, away from the chaos. From his vantage point, he could see both the viewport and the faces of all the delegates below. He wanted to watch both. He wanted to see the ship, and he wanted to see the galaxy's reaction. 2 minutes. Across the fleet, sensor operators ran their final checks. The Seravi battle swarm pulled in tighter. The Morith flagship powered its gravity well generators to standby. The Velori biocruisers sent a ripple across their living hulls, an involuntary twitch of stress. 1 minute. Ambassador Tolk Vron floated in his pod right at the front of the observation deck, his body glowing with a steady blue light. He had his neural link plugged directly into the station's main sensor array, feeding him raw data in real time. He watched the numbers scroll by. Velocity, trajectory, mass estimate. The mass estimate was still calculating, still climbing. That was strange. A ship's mass signature should have stabilized long before it arrived. This one just kept going up. He frowned, or at least did the Velori version of a frown, which was a darkening of the light along his brow. He was about to say something to the delegate next to him, but he never got the chance. At the exact moment predicted, something happened in that patch of space, but it wasn't anything they expected. There was no flash of light, no burst of energy, no wormhole or tear in reality that usually came with a faster-than-light arrival. Instead, space itself bent. That was the only way to describe it. The stars in that spot warped, curved, and twisted, as if some invisible giant had just pressed its thumb into the fabric of the universe. The distortion lasted for less than 2 seconds. And then, the ship was just there. It was simply there, as if it had been there all along, and the universe was only now getting around to showing them. 1 second, there was nothing but empty space. The next, there was something so massive and so dark that the mind recoiled, struggling to believe it was real. For exactly 4 seconds, no one said a word. Not a single delegate spoke. No sensor operator made a report. No commander gave an order. For 4 solid seconds, every being on the Nexus station and in the entire conquered fleet just stared, and then every alarm on every single ship screamed to life at the exact same time. The first reports that came in from the sensor operators were just broken fragments, choked with disbelief and confusion. The numbers couldn't be right. The instruments had to be broken. Recalibrations were ordered, run, and double-checked. The numbers didn't change. The human ship was 37 kilometers long. 37. The number flashed on screens across the fleet and the station, and it just sat there, impossible and undeniable. The Dralstone Leviathan, at 4 kilometers long, was supposed to be the biggest warship ever built. This thing was more than 9 times its size, but its size was just the beginning. As more sensor data flooded in, every new piece of information was more terrifying than the last. The ship's energy output was off the charts, beyond anything the Conquered had ever recorded. The power signature was consistent with only one thing: a contained stellar core, a miniature star, harnessed and trapped inside the ship's hull. This was the kind of tech that the top scientists of the so-called conquered races had only ever dreamed of, but never could build. The humans, the underdogs they'd laughed at, hadn't just built it. They'd made it portable and stuck it inside a warship. The ship's hull was made of something they had no record of. It was a deep, perfect black that seemed to swallow light instead of reflecting it. Basic scans showed layers of armor so dense, with patterns that suggested it could actually heal itself. But when they tried a deep scan, nothing. The ship's surface just ate the sensor pings like it ate the light, sending back zero data. You could see the weapon arrays, but you couldn't identify them. They lined the ship in neat rows, hundreds of them, and each one was bigger than most of the Concorde's own battleships. The analysts were stumped. Nothing in their databases looked even remotely similar. Their only guess at the power output came from the energy conduits feeding each weapon, and the estimates were so ridiculously high that a few analysts just deleted the logs, figuring their equipment had to be broken. The ship's shields weren't even on, but leftover energy readings hinted at a defense system with at least 12 different layers, each on its own frequency. The best ships the Concorde had used 3 layers. 12 wasn't just better. It was a completely different way of thinking about war. And the ship was beautiful, but in the way a sharpened blade is beautiful. It was all sharp angles and clean lines that screamed purpose, not decoration. This thing wasn't built to look good. It was built to do a job. And that job was clearly the absolute annihilation of anything that got in its way. The fact that it was impressive was just a side effect. One of the Veori analysts, a young woman monitoring the energy signals, ripped off her neural headset with trembling hands and whispered to nobody in particular, "That is not a ship. That is a mobile extinction event." That phrase shot through the station in minutes. Repeated in a dozen different languages, it would end up in history books all over the galaxy. On the observation deck, the party atmosphere vanished as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The Crevi stopped eating, their huge compound eyes locked on the viewport, their mandibles frozen for the first time anyone could remember. The velour's bioluminescent skin went completely dark, an involuntary fear response their species hadn't felt in over 4,000 years. The smaller delegations fell silent. Some backed away from the windows. A few were already scrambling for the exits, moving with the kind of hurry you see when people realize they're standing next to a ticking bomb. Ambassador Tolkfon just floated in his pod, dead still, his own body dark with shock. The data was pouring into his brain through his neural link, and every new piece of information was like a sledgehammer to everything he thought he knew. He'd assured the Council that humanity's military was a joke. He'd told them their tech was 2 centuries out of date. He wasn't just wrong. He was so monumentally, catastrophically wrong that the size of his mistake was impossible to measure. Out in the fleet, it was chaos. The comms channels were overloaded with commanders yelling at each other, demanding orders, demanding to know what in the worlds was going on. A few ships had their weapons systems kick in automatically, their targeting locks snapping onto the massive human vessel. It was like the desperate snarl of a small dog facing a predator it couldn't even comprehend. The Seravi battle swarm went to full alert. Plasma cannons hummed to life. Shields flared up. Their 40 fast attack ships snapped into an assault pattern, a formation designed to overwhelm a target from every angle at once. It was a tactic that had shattered entire fleets. Against the human ship, it looked like a handful of gnats getting ready to attack a mountain. The Morith flagship fired up its gravity well generators at maximum power, creating energy fields that could trap ships in place. The gravity wells shot toward the human ship and simply vanished. They didn't just fail. They didn't overload. They touched the very edge of the ship's passive energy field and just ceased to exist, like waves crashing against a cliff. On his ship, the Stone Leviathan, Commander Kordath felt the fear of his crew vibrating up through the floor. The Draw were almost never afraid. Kordath looked at the human vessel, and for the first time in his 600 years of service, he understood what it felt like to be prey. The human ship was so enormous, it blocked his entire view, a hole in space where the stars were supposed to be. The Stone Leviathan, the most powerful warship the Concorde had ever built, the pride of their entire fleet, was just a pebble floating in that shadow. Kordath sent a single command vibration through the bridge. It was an order the Drawal hadn't used in 3,000 years. It meant, do not engage. And through all of this, the human ship did nothing. It didn't raise its shields. It didn't power up a single weapon. It didn't try to communicate. It didn't react to the dozens of targeting locks painting its hull. It ignored every frantic message being blasted on every known frequency. It just hung there, vast and dark and silent, and waited. That silence was more terrifying than any weapon. You could understand a weapon. You could measure it, analyze it, and figure out how to fight it. But silence, from something that huge and that powerful? That was a message all on its own. And the message was loud and clear. You are not worth my attention. 12 minutes went by. For 12 solid minutes, the combined military power of the Galactic Concord aimed all its guns at a single human ship, and that ship didn't even bother putting its shields up. 12 minutes for every single commander out there to slowly realize that their weapons, their ships, their tactics, everything they'd built for thousands of years was insufficient. Not just outmatched, insufficient. It was like bringing a stone knife to a nuclear bomb fight. They weren't even in the same league. Then, on the 13th minute, something moved. A small bay opened on the underside of the human vessel, a door so tiny compared to the rest of the ship that the sensors almost didn't see it. A shuttle came out. It was ridiculously small, barely 30 meters long. It was a sleek little craft with no visible weapons. It undocked from the mothership and started moving slowly, without any rush, toward the Nexus station. One shuttle, one small boat crossing the space between the most powerful warship the galaxy had ever seen and a station full of diplomats who, less than an hour ago, had been joking about how primitive humans were. The fleet commanders all looked at each other over their comm screens. The question hung in the air, unspoken, but on everyone's mind. Do we let it pass? The answer came from the council itself. The session moderator, his voice audibly shaking, broadcast the order on all channels. Stand down, lower weapons, allow the shuttle to approach. I repeat, do not fire. Nobody argued. Not a single commander protested. One by one, the targeting locks clicked off, a wave of surrender washing through the fleet. Weapons powered down, shields were lowered. The Ceravi battle swarm broke formation, their perfect attack pattern dissolving into a random cloud of ships. The shuttle crossed the distance slowly, almost casually, like the pilot wasn't in any kind of hurry. It flew right between the massive warships of the conquered fleet, and every crew on every ship just watched it go by on their screens. It looked so small, so fragile, and yet not a single gun tracked it, because every single gun was still aimed at the monster it had come from, and every gunner knew that pulling the trigger would be the last thing they ever did. The shuttle reached the Nexus station and docked at the main diplomatic bay. The clamps locked on, the airlock cycled. On the observation deck, Iron SVC watched it all happen with a stillness that had nothing to do with being calm. Both of his hearts were pounding, a reaction his species only had in moments of life or death danger. He knew something was wrong. He'd felt it deep in his bones for days, but he had never imagined this. Nobody could have imagined this. He looked around at the faces of the other delegates. He saw fear. He saw shock. And he saw the dawn of a terrible new understanding. The entire galaxy had just changed, and everyone in that room knew it. But no one had a clue what to do about it. Down in the diplomatic bay, the shuttle door hissed open. Iron turned from the window and started moving quickly toward the grand deliberation chamber. Whatever happened next, it would happen there. Whatever walked out of that shuttle was about to walk into the very room where the galaxy made its most important decisions. He moved fast, but his mind was moving faster. He was thinking about that impossible ship, its size, its tech, its terrifying silence. He was thinking about what it meant that the humans had built something like that and decided to send it here, now. And he was thinking about the shuttle. One small shuttle, carrying one delegation from a species the conquered had written off as weak and backward, a species that had just parked a god in their front yard and sent a rowboat over to say hello. The hallway ahead was packed with other delegates, all rushing toward the chamber, their voices high and tight with fear. Imagine being the last hope for a defeated people, walking into a room filled with your conquerors. They broke your armies, shattered your worlds, and now they expect you to crawl. But what if you did something else entirely? What if you showed them something they never expected? You're not going to want to miss what happens next. The frantic footsteps and arrogant laughter were long gone. The bets on how humanity would beg were forgotten. The party was officially over. Iran SVC moved through the silent crowd, his tall frame a stark contrast to their hunched shoulders. He didn't say a word. What was there to say? The universe had already made its point with a 37-kilometer-long warship hanging right outside their window, a steel monster blotting out the stars like a hand covering the sky. Now it was humanity's turn to speak. He found his seat in the grand deliberation chamber just as the colossal doors at the far end sealed shut. The human delegation was on its way. Every seat was taken, every eye fixed forward. This hall, which had echoed with boastful chatter just days before, was now dead silent. The place was designed to be terrifying, a cavern carved from the heart of an asteroid. The architects knew politics was just theater, and this stage was built to make every actor feel tiny and insignificant. The ceiling soared 40 meters into darkness, and the walls curved in like the ribs of some titanic beast. A 200-meter aisle stretched from the doors to the podium, a long, lonely walk designed to make anyone who dared to cross it feel utterly exposed and judged. It had always worked, until today. Proud warrior ambassadors had scurried down that aisle. Ancient diplomats had walked it with slumped shoulders. Even the draw, a species of living rock who feared nothing, seemed to weigh heavier in this space. But today, the chamber was about to meet a whole new kind of player. 312 delegates from 34 different species filled the hall. The most powerful among them sat closest to the aisle, forming a living gauntlet of galactic power that any newcomer would have to endure. It was a stare-down of epic proportions. Armed guards lined the walls, Kriavi warriors in full battle armor holding plasma lances ready for a fight. Massive Drawl sentinels, each one a nearly 5-meter-tall pillar of living stone, stood like statues. And clinging to the high walls were Veori bioconstructs, shapeless blobs of engineered flesh that could morph into deadly weapons in a heartbeat. The security was way over the top, and everyone knew it. It was all part of the show. But this time, the show felt different. The guards, meant to intimidate the humans, were making the delegates themselves sweat. Every weapon in the room was just a pathetic reminder that nothing they had could possibly threaten that black metal leviathan hanging in space. Iran SVC watched it all from his usual seat in the back. He'd picked this spot 300 years ago for its perfect view of the entire room, allowing him to see every nervous tick and flicker of fear. Today, that view was telling him a story. The senior Saravi hive speaker, Vray, sat stiff as a board, her forearms crossed tightly. Her mandibles were clenched in a show of aggression, but her big compound eyes were darting all over the place, checking the exits. Oh yeah, she was scared, and she was furious about it. The Veori delegates had turned their inner lights down to a faint, steady glow. It was their version of whispering, of trying to disappear into the background. Ambassador Tolk Van was a barely-there shimmer in his pod, his confidence shattered by whatever data he'd seen on the human ship. The 3 massive Drawal delegates stood in their alcove, patient as mountains. If they felt fear, they didn't show it. The smaller delegations huddled together for warmth, species who survived by being smart enough to know when they were completely and utterly outclassed. And they knew it the second that human ship had warped into their system. The moderator stood at the podium, his 6 hands gripping the stone. In 40 years, his voice had never trembled. Today, it did. "Delegates," he announced, his voice echoing in the silence. "The human delegation is approaching. As per the protocols for a conquered people, they will be received." He paused, and the only sound was the faint hum of the station's life support. "Open the doors." The great stone doors, each 115 meters tall and weighing thousands of tons, began to grind open. Light from the hallway poured in, framing a bright rectangle in the gloom. 312 sets of eyes, lenses, sensors, and receptors, all zoomed in on that opening. They were expecting a crowd. Protocol demanded a big delegation, an ambassador, military advisors, translators, security, the works. Some species showed up with 50 people for their first hearing. The Sci-Fi had brought 70, including an honor guard that did a whole war dance down the aisle. The doors settled into place, fully open. The hallway beyond was empty, except for one person. A single human figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the light. She wasn't tall, maybe 1.7 meters, making her smaller than almost everyone in that chamber. She wore a simple dark uniform with no medals, no rank, nothing. Her hair was cut short. Her face was a mask of calm. She had no weapon. She wore no armor. She had no guards, no advisors, not even a translator. She was completely, utterly alone. She stood there for some moment, looking into a room filled with hundreds of armed aliens, like someone peeking into a coffee shop to see if it's busy. Then she stepped inside and started to walk. Her boots made a sharp, clean sound on the stone floor. Clack, clack. In the dead silence of that massive hall, each footstep sounded like a gunshot. She didn't rush, and she didn't hesitate. She just walked down that long, intimidating aisle, and somehow she didn't look small or exposed at all. She looked like she owned the very ground beneath her feet. As she passed, every head turned to watch her. The Kriavi warriors tightened their grip on their lances. The shapeless bioconstructs on the ceiling rippled with unease. The stone-faced Droal sentinels didn't budge, but their eyes tracked her with a terrifying focus. She walked past the silver-skinned delegates of the Morith Communion, who stared with a mix of awe and horror. She passed the Polani, whose 6-limbed delegates shrank back in their seats, as if she were giving off an electric charge. She passed Ambassador Tolk Van's pod, and his light flickered wildly, broadcasting his fear for all to see. She passed the Sci-Fi platform, where Hive Speaker Vray glared with all of her compound eyes, body rigid with tension. The human didn't even glance at her. She didn't look at any of them. Her eyes were locked on the podium at the far end of the hall, and she walked toward it as if nothing else in the universe existed. It took her almost 3 minutes to cross that 200-meter aisle. 3 solid minutes where the most powerful beings in the galaxy watched a single, unarmed human woman stroll through their cathedral of power, and not a single one of them dared to make a sound. And from his seat in the back, Irin SVC finally understood. This wasn't bravery, though she was brave. And it wasn't arrogance, though it looked a lot like it. It was a message, delivered in a language so simple that every single species in that room, from the bug warriors to the rock giants, could understand it perfectly. The message was this: we are not afraid of you. Not like a fool who doesn't see the danger. She knew exactly what weapons were pointed at her, what monsters lined the walls, what warship waited outside. She saw it all, and she walked through it without armor, without help, without hesitation. Because she and her entire species had decided that fear was a weapon they would never hand to their enemies again. The reason no one could see the ship was because it was parked right outside the station, a 37-kilometer shadow that spoke the language of power in a voice they'd never heard before. One ship, one woman, but the message was crystal clear. We are here, we aren't asking, and we are not afraid. The entire chamber was frozen solid. That's the only way to describe it. 312 beings from every corner of the galaxy, creatures who had toppled worlds, built star-spanning empires, and twisted the very laws of physics to their will, sat in dead silence and watched a single human walk. When she got to the podium, she stopped, turned, and for the very first time, she actually looked at them. Her eyes swept across the massive room, deliberately meeting the gaze of every single delegation. The Seravi, the Velori, the Morith, the Drow, and dozens of other, smaller species were huddled in their seats. She sized up each one of them, not with anger or disgust, but with a kind of calm, detailed focus that was somehow more terrifying than either. When she finally spoke, her voice was perfectly level and clear, filling the chamber without a hint of effort. The translation system worked flawlessly, delivering her words to every delegate at the exact same time. There were no glitches, no delays, no mixed-up words. It was as if the humans had hacked their most secret translation codes and mastered them before they even showed up. In that exact moment, every delegate realized this, and it felt like another heavy stone dropping into their gut. "My name is Captain Marin Ashcroft," she said. "I'm the commanding officer of the Terran Commonwealth ship, the Erebus, Titan-class hull designation 0001. I'm here representing the Terran Commonwealth and the 8 billion citizens of humanity." She paused, and the silence stretched on. "I'll make this short, because I think you've already gotten the main point of my message. You heard it when our ship arrived. You heard it in the quiet that came after. I'm just here to put words to what you already feel." She clasped her hands behind her back, a simple, almost casual move that somehow made her look even more in command, like she was on the bridge of her own ship instead of in a room full of powerful strangers who could snuff her out in an instant. "Humanity is not looking to conquer anyone. We have zero interest in ruling other species. We didn't build the Erebus to intimidate you, and we didn't come here to scare you. If you're scared, that's on you, and I respect your feelings. But that was never our goal." She let that idea hang in the air for a second. Humanity also doesn't ask for permission. We will expand into the galaxy however we think is best. We will explore where we want, settle where we want, and build what we want. We've been doing this since the first human walked out of Africa on our homeworld, looked at the horizon, and decided to see what was over there. We're not about to stop now. The Sarivi Hive speaker shifted in her seat, her mandibles clicking open as if she was about to protest, but nothing came out. "What humanity is looking for," Ashcroft went on, "is a partnership, a real one, not the kind where one side kneels while the other stands. Not the kind where joining your little club comes with a bunch of rules and rankings and waiting games designed to make the new guy feel small. We've read your rules. We know how you treat newcomers. We're not interested." She took a breath. "We're offering you something else. Trade between equals, sharing cultures between equals, defending each other as equals. We have technology you want. Our ship makes that pretty clear. And you have things we want. The wisdom of species who have been traveling the stars for thousands of years is valuable. We're not too proud to admit that." Her eyes scanned the room again. "But I need to be perfectly clear about one thing. We are offering you an open hand, and that hand is open because we chose to open it. Not because we need your permission. Not because we need you to protect us, and definitely not because we can't make it without you. We can. The Erebus isn't our only Titan-class warship. She's just the first one we decided to send." The sheer weight of that sentence fell on the chamber like a physical blanket. She'd said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, as if she were just mentioning a minor detail. And that's what made it so much worse. The meaning behind it was massive, and she had dropped it on them like a weather report. She unclasped her hands and rested them on the podium. "I've been told this chamber has listened to 10,000 years of speeches. I've been told that species come here to brag about their civilizations, their history, and their right to be among the stars. I'm not going to do that. You don't need another speech. You just need to understand one thing about humanity. and I'm going to tell you right now." She looked right at the center of the room, straight at the delegation of the most powerful species there. "We didn't come here because we needed you. We came here because we were hoping you'd be worth getting to know." She then stepped away from the podium. "I'm finished." The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the sound of people thinking. It was the sound of 300 beings having their entire view of the universe flipped upside down in 5 minutes by a woman who was barely tall enough to see over the podium. Irin SV sat in his chair and felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in 300 years of diplomatic work. He felt pure wonder, not at the ship or the tech, but at the woman. At the incredible, unbelievable guts it took to walk into a room that could kill her and speak to them as if they should be thanking her for showing up. He reached into his coat for a small recording device, a personal log he used for historically important moments. He turned it on and spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Personal log. Liaison Irin SV, Sinithari Diplomatic Corps. Date, Standard Galactic Calendar, year 7412, day 188. I'm recording this from the Grand Deliberation Chamber of the Galactic Nexus, just moments after the first formal speech by a representative of the human species." He paused, gathering his thoughts. One shadow crossed the chamber. That's what I'll remember. A single shadow from a single woman, walking across 200 meters of stone floor while 300 delegates held their breath. Not because we were scared of what she might do. We were scared of her because we finally understood just how much we didn't know. He stopped the recording and put it away. All around him, the chamber was slowly coming back to life. Delegates were turning to each other, whispering and gesturing, their cool composure finally cracking like ice on a warm day. The Seravi were clicking their mandibles in fast, angry rhythms. The Valori were pulsing with chaotic, flashing lights. The smaller species were all talking over one another in terrified little groups. And through it all, Captain Marine Ashcroft stood at the podium, watching them with the same calm look she had when she first walked in. She didn't fidget. She didn't look nervous. She just stood there like someone who had said exactly what she meant to say and was now just waiting for the rest of the galaxy to get on her level. The session moderator, who had been clutching the podium for dear life during her entire speech, finally let go and straightened up his tiny body. "The delegate from humanity has spoken," he announced, his voice cracking on the word humanity. He cleared his throat. "The floor is now open for questions." For a long, tense moment, nobody said a word. Then, everybody started talking at once, and the chamber exploded into the loudest, most chaotic session in its 10,000-year history. But through all the yelling and arguing and panic, one image was burned into the mind of every single person there. A lone figure, small and dark against the pale stone floor, walking through a hall of gods and monsters without rushing, without hesitating, without even a glance to the side. One shadow crossed the chamber, and after that, nothing was ever the same. The Grand Deliberation Chamber hadn't calmed down in the 6 hours since Captain Ashcroft had finished her speech. In fact, it had only gotten louder. Delegates were shouting at each other across the aisles, and the translation systems were struggling to keep up. The moderator had called for order 11 times, and 11 times he had been completely ignored. The arguments had split everyone into 3 main groups, and the divisions between them were getting deeper by the hour. The first group, led by the Seravi, was demanding an immediate military strike. Hive Speaker Vrek stood on her platform, all 4 of her arms spread wide, her voice slicing through the chaos like a knife. "They show up with 1 ship and 1 soldier, and they talk to us like we're children," she screamed. "This isn't a negotiation, it's an insult. If we don't meet their strength with our own, every minor species in the galaxy will think this conclave is weak." Her warriors stomped their armored feet in agreement, the booming sound shaking the stone floor. The Seravi had built their entire empire on one simple idea: power must always be met with greater power. To do anything less was to invite your own destruction. Several smaller, more warlike species nodded in agreement, though they weren't cheering quite as loudly as they had been before the Erebus arrived. A second group, led by the Velori, urged everyone to be patient and study the situation. Ambassador Tolk Vaughn, having collected himself, finally spoke, though his bioluminescent glow was weak and flickering. "We know practically nothing about this species," he said, his voice holding the careful, measured tone of a scientist who'd just discovered his entire field was built on a lie. "We assumed they were primitive. We were dead wrong. Before we do anything, we have to understand what we're facing. Anything less is just reckless." Several other delegations murmured in agreement. The Morith Communion, the Savari, the Pilani, and a few others argued the wisest course was to accept humanity's offer of partnership, at least for now, and use that time to learn everything they could about their technology, their culture, and their weaknesses, if they even had any. The third camp was made up of those who were simply too terrified to argue for any course of action. These were mostly the smaller species, civilizations that had gotten by in the galaxy by staying out of the way of the major powers. They had no desire to fight the humans, and they certainly didn't want to befriend them. They just wanted to go home, lock their borders, and pray that whatever came next would happen to someone else. And through all this, the Drawl hadn't said a word. They stood in their alcove like 3 stone pillars, watching the chaos unfold with completely unreadable eyes. The Drawl almost never spoke in an open session. When they did, the entire galaxy paid attention, because the Drawl never wasted words, and their words were almost always followed by decisive action. So, when the Drawl Elder, the biggest of the 3, shifted his immense weight and started toward the podium, the chamber went dead silent in a matter of seconds. It was like someone flipped a switch. Delegates froze mid-sentence, their hands fell to their sides, their mandibles snapped shut. Every single eye in that room was fixed on the massive, stone-like figure moving slowly and deliberately to the center of the floor. The Drawl Elder was the oldest living being in the entire Concord. Nobody knew his real age. Some guessed he was over 12,000 years old. He was there when the Concord was first formed. He had watched species rise and fall, species that were now just memories. In his native language, his name was a vibration that other races couldn't even pronounce. Because of that, the translation matrix just called him the Elder. He reached a spot near the podium and stopped. He didn't step up onto it. The Drawl didn't use them. He just stood there and let the sheer force of his presence blanket the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and slow, like the grinding of tectonic plates. Every word landed with the weight of something that had been thought about for a very, very long time. "We have seen the human ship." He paused. The chamber held its breath. "It is beyond our ability to build. It is beyond our ability to fight. It is beyond our ability to break. We have analyzed it with our instruments, our experience, and our understanding. And by every single measure, it is superior to us." Another pause, this one even longer. "We will not fight them. If others wish to fight them, that is their choice. The Drawl will not participate. This isn't cowardice. This is simple recognition. The humans have created something that fundamentally changes the balance of power in this galaxy, and we will not commit suicide by refusing to see what's right in front of our faces." He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over each delegation. "Discuss it among yourselves." With that, he walked back to his alcove and became a statue once more. He didn't say another word. The silence stretched for almost a full minute. Then the chamber erupted. The Drawl were the military backbone of the Concord. Their stone leviathans were the most powerful warships in the entire fleet. Their ground troops were legendary for being unbreakable. For over 3,000 years, the Drawal's unwavering commitment to the Conquered's defense was the bedrock of galactic peace. Without them, the Conquered's military was a shadow of its perceived strength, and the Drawal had just announced, in front of every species in the galaxy, that they refused to fight the humans. The Creevy were the first to lose it. Hive Speaker Vray's huge compound eyes burned with rage. "Cowards!" she shrieked. "You rock-hearted cowards! You'd surrender without firing a single shot!" The Drawal gave no reply. They never did. Responding to insults was beneath them, which only had the effect of making the one shouting the insults look like a fool. This, of course, just made Vray even angrier, but the damage was done. Without the Drawal, the Conquered couldn't possibly mount a serious military threat against the Erebus, and everyone in that room knew it. The Creevy had 40 fast attack ships. The Valori had a dozen biocruisers. The Morith had their flagship. Altogether, they might pose a threat to a normal enemy. But against a ship that was 9 times the size of a stone leviathan and was powered by a captured star, they were absolutely nothing. As the arguments raged on, something else started to happen. Something much quieter, but far more important than all the shouting. Small delegations started slipping out of the chamber. They didn't use the main doors, which were being watched. They used the side hallways that led to the station's diplomatic wing. They left in small groups of 1 or 2, trying not to be noticed, and they were all heading in the exact same direction, toward the docking bay where the human shuttle was parked. The Polani went first. They were a small, physically weak species with no military to speak of. Their entire survival strategy was to make themselves useful to bigger powers, and they had a keen sense for which way the political winds were blowing. Within an hour of the Drawal Elder's statement, a Polani trade delegation was formally requesting a meeting with the human representative. The Savarai were next, then the Torch Speakers of Enith, and then the Morith Communion, who had quickly done the math and realized that being one of the first to side with humanity was worth a lot more than loyalty to a Conquered that could no longer protect them. By the end of the day, 12 different species had made informal contact with the human shuttle. A steady stream of trade proposals, offers of cultural exchange, and inquiries about mutual defense treaties flooded in. The galaxy was reorganizing itself in real time, and the Conquered's old power structure was crumbling under the weight of 37 kilometers of undeniable reality. Captain Ashcroft received every inquiry, acknowledged them politely, and promised to schedule follow-up consultations. Then she got back in her shuttle and flew back to the Erebus. The small ship crossed the space between the station and the warship, passed through the docking bay, and was completely swallowed by the sheer scale of the ship's interior. The bay doors slid shut, and from the outside the Erebus looked just as it had before, dark, silent, and immovable. But inside, it was a completely different world. The Erebus wasn't just a warship, it was a city. Its internal space was so enormous that entire districts had been built inside its hull, all linked by transit systems that shuttled thousands of people through corridors wide enough for ground vehicles. There were apartment blocks where crew members lived, complete with windows that looked out onto simulated skies. There were parks with real trees and grass growing under full-spectrum lights that mimicked a planet's day-night cycle. There were labs, factories, hospitals, schools, and rec centers. There were restaurants and cafes, and even a small district the crew nicknamed The Strip, where off-duty staff could find bars, live music, and a movie theater that played old films from Earth. The crew was 80,000 strong. They were engineers, scientists, soldiers, pilots, doctors, teachers, and administrators, along with 100 other professions needed to keep a city ship like this running. They came from every country on Earth and every human colony in space. They spoke dozens of languages, held on to dozens of different traditions, and argued about everything from politics and sports to the right way to make coffee. In every sense, they were a perfect slice of humanity, messy, loud, stubborn, and wonderfully alive. Captain Ashcroft's shuttle docked in the command section, and she stepped out into a bustling corridor filled with crew members going about their day. A young lieutenant snapped a salute as she walked by. A maintenance crew was fixing an overhead light, one of them telling a joke that made the others laugh out loud. A group of off-duty engineers passed by, carrying takeout containers and debating some technical problem that Ashcroft didn't quite catch. She made her way to the command bridge, a huge room in the heart of the ship where dozens of officers monitored every system on the Erebus and scanned the space around them. Holographic displays filled the air with glowing data. The main view screen, a full 20 meters wide, showed the Nexus station and the Concord fleet, looking small and insignificant in the distance. Her executive officer, Commander Don Aoro, was waiting for her. Aoro was a tall man with dark skin, a shaved head, and the kind of unshakable calm that made him the perfect balance for Ashcroft's intensity. He'd served with her for 12 years and knew her well enough to see the stress in the set of her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes. "How'd it go?" he asked simply. Ashcroft walked to the main view screen and stared out at the distant station. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she let out a long, slow breath, and the ironclad composure she had worn like armor for the last few hours finally cracked. Just a little, but enough for Aoro to see. "It went exactly as we planned," she said. She turned to face him. "But that walk was the hardest thing I have ever done, Don. 200 meters, 3 minutes. I've flown combat missions, faced down pirates in the belt, and landed a shuttle on manual after the main engine quit during re-entry. None of it even comes close to that. I had to walk into a room filled with beings who could kill me with a stray thought, and I had to act like I couldn't care less." Aoro looked at her, searching her face. "And did you?" "Did I what? Care?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Every single step. I cared about every single step. My hands were shaking behind my back the whole time. You know why I clasped them? Because I couldn't keep them from trembling." She sank into the command chair, rubbing her tired eyes. All around her, the bridge crew went about their duties, but more than a few were listening in. They'd been on pins and needles, waiting for her return. They'd watched the sensor feeds as she walked into that alien chamber all by herself, and they'd held their breath right alongside the aliens. "The real question is, did they believe it?" Aoro asked. Ashcroft stared back at him. "Every word I spoke was the absolute truth. That's what makes it so terrifying. For them, and for us." Aoro gave a slow nod. He understood exactly what she meant. Everything she had told the Concord was, on a technical level, accurate. The Erebus was real. Its weapons were real. Its power was undeniable. And humanity's refusal to back down was very, very real. But the version of the story she told them, a story of a species so mighty it could send a single ship and one lone person without a second thought for the consequences? That story left out quite a few important details. It left out what it had cost. The Titan-class program had practically shattered Earth's economy. The Erebus was the culmination of 30 years of relentless work, involving every major nation and corporation in human-controlled space. All the resources that could have gone into building new colonies, hospitals, research outposts, and vital infrastructure had been funneled into this one single ship. The project ignited political firestorms, triggered economic recessions, and caused social chaos on 3 different continents. Entire generations of brilliant scientists and engineers had poured their entire lives into its creation, many of them passing away long before they could see it finished. And when it was finally done, when the Erebus at last took to the stars and its systems hummed to life for the very first time, the people who built it didn't feel triumph. They felt pure terror, because they understood exactly what it represented. It meant that humanity had just bet everything it had on a single, desperate hand of cards. If their massive gamble paid off, if the Erebus was impressive enough to cement humanity's place as a power to be respected in the galaxy, then the investment would be returned 1,000 times over. But if it failed, if the galaxy called their bluff, if the conquered decided to truly test humanity's might, then the price of failure would be too staggering to even imagine. Because the Erebus wasn't just one of their top ships, it was their only one. Ashcraftoft had told the conquered that it wasn't their only Titan-class warship, just the first one they had chosen to send. This was, technically, true. There were 2 more Titan-class hulls being built in the massive shipyards orbiting Jupiter, but they were still years away from being complete. Their power cores hadn't even been installed. Their advanced weapon systems were nothing more than blueprints on a computer screen. They were empty shells, just the promise of future power that was useless in the here and now. If the conquered threw everything they had at the Erebus right now, they would almost certainly be defeated. The ship was just that powerful. But if, by some miracle, they won, if they discovered a hidden weakness or a vulnerability the human engineers had overlooked, then there would be nothing left to back it up. No second ship, no reserve fleet, just 300 standard warships and 17 colony worlds packed with people who had sacrificed everything to build one impossible dream. The gamble wasn't that the Erebus was strong enough to win. The gamble was that no one in the galaxy would ever dare to test it. Okoro poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine near the bridge's back console. It was that same awful, bitter coffee that was standard on all military ships, the one that no amount of technological progress ever seemed to improve. He handed one to Ashcraftoft and kept the other for himself. 12 species have already made contact, he said, sinking into the chair next to hers. Mostly trade offers, with a few inquiries about mutual defense. The Pilani want to talk about a technology exchange. Ashcraftoft took a sip of the coffee. The Pilani just want to make sure they're on the winning team. They always do. Can you really blame them? No. This is precisely the reaction we were hoping for. If enough species willingly side with us, the conquered can't move against us without shattering their own alliance. That was the core of the plan all along. Get them so invested in peace that they can't afford to risk a war. She took another sip of the coffee and winced. This is horrible. It's always horrible. One day we'll build a ship that can cross the entire galaxy, but we still won't be able to brew a decent cup of coffee. Meanwhile, light years away on the Nexus station, Liaison Iron Salve had escaped the noisy chaos of the deliberation chamber for the quiet of his private quarters. The room was small and minimalist, just how the Nethari liked it, with a single desk, a sleeping mat, and a data terminal that connected him to the Conquered's enormous archive of intelligence files. Iron sat down at the desk and started his search. He wasn't looking for files on the Erebus. Everyone else was already doing that. They were all busy measuring its dimensions, counting its weapon emplacements, and trying to calculate its power output. Iron couldn't care less about the ship. He was interested in the species that had built it. He began his search with the most ancient records he could access, data gathered from deep space probes that had drifted through the Sol system and the surrounding space over the last few centuries. Most of these probes were launched by the Conquered for general survey missions, just mapping star systems and logging any signs of budding civilizations. The probes that passed near Earth had simply flagged it as a Category 7 death world inhabited by a pre-spaceflight civilization and kept right on going. Nobody gave it a second thought, but those probes had still recorded data, electromagnetic signals, atmospheric composition, and images of the surface. And as Iron carefully sorted through this mountain of information, organizing it by date and applying his analytical expertise, a shocking picture started to emerge. It was a picture of a species completely unlike any the Conquered had ever documented. Earth's own geological history showed 5 catastrophic mass extinction events. 5 separate times, the planet had nearly wiped itself clean, killing off the vast majority of all living things. And 5 times, life had clawed its way back from the brink and started over. The species that would one day become human arose from the ashes of the latest cataclysm and immediately began a desperate struggle to survive in one of the most hostile environments in the known galaxy. They had no natural armor plating. They had no venom sacs. They had no claws to speak of, no wings, no ability to breathe in water, and no way to tolerate extreme temperatures. By all logical metrics, they should have been wiped out almost immediately. The predators that shared their world were faster, stronger, and far better armed. The climate was dangerously unstable. The planet itself was geologically violent. But they didn't die. They adapted. They created tools. They tamed fire. They invented language. They formed small groups, which grew into tribes, which then became nations. And through every single stage of their development, they fought. They fought their planet. They fought the predators. They fought each other. They fought diseases, starvation, floods, and droughts. They fought devastating wars that killed millions of their own people. Wars so horrifically destructive that they eventually built weapons with the power to sterilize their entire world. And then they stood on the very edge of that self-made abyss, and after staring into it, they chose, just barely, not to jump. And then they just kept right on going. They traveled to their moon. They sent robotic explorers to other planets. They constructed telescopes powerful enough to see the edge of the known universe. They deciphered the very code of their own biology and then started to rewrite it. They created thinking machines. They split the atom. Then they figured out how to fuse it back together. Every single disaster that would have been the final chapter for another species, every catastrophe that would have sent a lesser civilization into a permanent dark age, only seemed to make them angrier, more inventive, more determined, and more stubborn. Iron leaned back in his chair, his eyes wide as he stared at the data flowing across his screen. He had studied hundreds of different species over his long career. He had seen fierce warrior cultures, brilliant scientific cultures, shrewd trading cultures, and cultures so ancient they had forgotten more history than most species would ever learn. But he had never, ever seen anything like this. The Erebus wasn't the creation of a species that was naturally superior. It wasn't born from ancient wisdom or limitless resources or some unique genetic gift that others didn't have. It was the product of a pure, stubborn, and completely irrational refusal to ever accept limitations. Humanity had looked at every single obstacle the universe had ever thrown in its way and had responded not with acceptance or simple adaptation, but with raw defiance. They didn't go around their problems. They didn't patiently wait for their problems to go away. They attacked their problems with every single tool they had, and when their tools weren't good enough, they simply built better ones. And when those better tools still weren't enough, they built tools that were supposed to be impossible. And they kept on doing this until the problem was either solved or they were dead. And it turned out they were very, very hard to kill. Iron shut down the data terminal and sat in the quiet, dim light of his room, just thinking. Through his window, he could just make out the distant silhouette of the Erebus, a thin, dark line against the backdrop of stars, barely there, but completely impossible to ignore. He finally understood. The ship wasn't the real threat. The ship was just a symptom. The real threat was the thing that had built it. A species that had been locked in a fight for its own survival since the moment it first evolved, and had never once, in its entire history, even considered the possibility that it might actually lose. He reached for his personal log and switched it on. Supplemental entry. I have spent the last several hours researching the history and development of humanity. My conclusion is as follows. The Erebus is not some fluke. It is not a lucky break or a one-time wonder. It is the perfectly natural result of a species that has been hammered and shaped by 10,000 years of non-stop hardship into something the galaxy has never seen before. He paused for a moment. We never should have laughed at them. We should have been paying very close attention. He shut down the recording and gazed out the window once more. The massive ship, the Erebus, just hung there in the void, silent and patient. In that moment, Iran SVC felt his entire perception of the universe shrink. It was a smaller place than he'd ever imagined, and it was about to get a whole lot more interesting. For 3 straight days, the Galactic Concord was shaken to its very core. The Grand Deliberation Chamber had become a war zone of words, where threats, promises, and raw fear were the only weapons. Delegates were either passed out in their seats or running on fumes. The translation computers whirred non-stop, trying to make sense of thousands of arguments in dozens of languages all at once. The moderator had long since given up on keeping order. He just kept the doors open and let the hurricane blow itself out. The question that was tearing the council apart was simple on the surface, but terrifying when you really thought about it. What were they going to do about humanity? The Creevy were pushing the hardest for a fight. Their hive speaker, Vray, had been a whirlwind of motion for all 3 days, darting between groups, forging alliances, promising military aid, and bullying anyone who wouldn't side with her. Her message was simple and sharp. If the Conquered showed weakness now, they'd be finished. If they let some new species just waltz in and start making demands, everyone else would try the exact same thing. The Conquered's power rested on its ability to back up its laws, and that meant being willing to go to war. But there was a massive, gaping hole in Vray's argument that got bigger by the hour, and that hole was shaped exactly like the Drawall. Without the Drawall fleet, the Conquered couldn't make a believable threat against anyone, especially not a species that had just parked a 37-kilometer warship on their front porch. The Drawall had already made it crystal clear where they stood, and the Drawall never, ever changed their minds. Vray knew it. They all knew it. But the Creevy were a species drowning in pride, and that pride was making them blind to the facts. The Velori, on the other hand, were pushing for a smarter play. Their ambassador, Tolkron, having shaken off his initial shock, was back to being a master diplomat. He spent the 3 days pulling together a group of level-headed species who preferred talking over fighting. His argument was all about common sense. Humanity had offered them a partnership. Who cares if they were sincere? It was smarter to say yes and get a look at them from the inside than to say no and be left completely in the dark. Knowledge is power, after all. And right then, the Conquered knew next to nothing about what humanity could actually do. Every single hour they wasted arguing was an hour they weren't gathering intel. The third group, the scared, stiff neutrals, slowly started to disappear as the debate raged on. They were either convinced by Tolkron's logic or strong-armed by the Creevy into picking a side. By the close of the second day, only 3 species were still on the fence. On the morning of the third day, the moderator finally called for a vote on letting humanity into the Conquered. The proposal came with a catch that had never been used in the history of the Conquered: immediate Tier 1 status, putting them on the same level as the original founding species. This little bombshell was dropped by the Morith Communion, and it was the single most explosive part of the whole debate. Tier 1 status meant full voting rights, the power to veto any military action, and a permanent chair on the Inner Council. The founding species had earned that honor over thousands of years of loyalty and sacrifice. Giving it to a species that showed up just 3 days ago was, as one enraged Creevy delegate put it, an insult to every civilization that built this Conquered from the ground up. But the Morith delegate, a slick diplomat named Turles, had the perfect comeback. He simply asked, "Would you like to be the one to tell humanity they have to wait 1,000 years for full membership? Would you like to deliver that message to the captain of the Erebus? I'd be happy to arrange a shuttle for you." Nobody took him up on the offer. The vote was called. One by one, each species sent their decision, and the results lit up the giant holographic screen in the center of the room. The numbers climbed slowly. In favor, 29. Against, 4. That was the Kravi, two of their closest allies, and one grumpy isolationist civilization from the edge of the galaxy that, as a rule, voted no on everything. Abstaining, 1. That was the Droal, who sent a message saying they acknowledged humanity's existence regardless of any vote this body might take, which was their way of saying the vote was a joke and they'd deal with the humans themselves. The motion passed. Humanity was now part of the Galactic Concord, with full Tier 1 status, effective immediately. The chamber exploded. You heard applause, angry shouts, and the sound of pure, exhausted silence, all mixed together. Hive Speaker Vray just stormed out without a word, her personal guard marching behind her in perfect sync, their armored boots echoing like thunder on the stone floor long after they were gone. The news shot across the galaxy at the speed of light. The reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Some planets celebrated, some planets panicked, and some planets started quietly moving their warships around. On a dozen different worlds, governments that had been watching from the sidelines immediately started writing up their own welcome letters to humanity, trying to get in good with the new guys before their rivals could. But the vote wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't even the beginning. Just 2 days later, a hot-headed faction within the Kravi military decided it was time to poke the bear. The plan was hatched by a group of senior officers, loyal to Hive Speaker Vray, who all believed that the only way to answer strength is with more strength. They didn't tell Vray about their plan. They didn't tell anyone. They went for it alone, fueled by wounded pride and the genuine boneheaded belief that someone had to stand up to the newcomers. 12 ships from the Kravi battle fleet broke formation without getting permission. They were fast attack corvettes, the smallest warships they had, but they were crewed by hardened veterans. They powered up their weapons, raised their shields, and blasted toward the Erebus on a full-on attack run. They weren't actually planning to shoot. The idea was to do an aggressive, high-speed flyby with their weapons glowing hot, just to test the human ship's reflexes and to send a clear message. Not everyone in the Concord was ready to bow down. It was a plan born from a cocktail of pride and stupidity, cooked up by officers who confused bravery with recklessness. In a matter of minutes, the 12 corvettes closed the distance to the Erebus. Their plasma cannons hummed with energy, their targeting systems locked on. They came in from all different angles, just like they would in a real fight, painting the massive human ship with targeting data. On the Nexus station, the sensor operators saw the unauthorized ships and sounded the alarm instantly. Sirens blared across the entire fleet. Commanders started yelling orders. The session moderator was yanked out of a meeting and told that 12 Kravi warships were about to attack the human vessel. The result was pure, absolute chaos. Delegates were literally running to the observation decks to see what was happening. Fleet commanders were frantically trying to get the Kravi ships on the line to order them to back down, but the communication channels were totally jammed. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the Erebus, the sensor officer reported the incoming ships with the calm of a seasoned pro. 12 small vessels on an attack approach, Captain. Weapons are hot. We have active targeting locks. They'll be in range in 90 seconds. Captain Ashcraft was in her command chair. She hadn't left the bridge since she got back from the station, surviving on 2 hours of sleep, coffee, and sheer willpower. She glanced at the sensor screen, saw the 12 approaching dots, and felt a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline. "What are they?" she asked. "Corvette class, Kravi design. They're lightly armored, armed with plasma cannons. Fast but delicate. Threat assessment, negligible." Ashcraft gave a slight nod. All 12 of those ships could unload everything they had on the Erebus, and the shields wouldn't even flicker. The real threat wasn't physical, it was political. If she blew them out of the sky, the peace they just made would be shattered. But if she did nothing, they'd see it as a sign of weakness and just keep pushing. She needed another way out. Weapons, she said calmly. Standing by, Captain. Stand them down. I don't want a single cannon powered up. The weapons officer gave her a look of disbelief, but did as he was told. The tension on the bridge was so thick you could feel it. Electronic warfare, Ashcraft said, her voice steady. Target all 12 of those ships. I want you to hit them with a single focused sensor pulse. Full spectrum, maximum power. I want to shut down every system they have except life support. Darken their engines, cool their weapons, blind their sensors, and cut their comms. And I want it done in one go. The E-War officer, a young lieutenant named Chen, stared at her console, then looked back at the captain. One pulse for all 12 simultaneously? Ma'am, that means we'd have to crack their encryption, bypass their firewalls, and override their hardware in less than a second. You ready? Captain Ashcraft asked, her eyes fixed on the console as Chen's fingers danced over the controls. Ready, Captain. Then let him have it. The dozen enemy corvettes were 60 seconds from tearing them apart when the starship Erebus finally answered. There was no thunderous blast, no blinding flash of light, not even a whisper that could travel through the vacuum of space. There was just a single, invisible pulse of energy that shot across the distance in a fraction of a second. In that same instant, every single system on all 12 enemy ships died. The shutdown was absolute. Engines went silent, weapons powered down, shields vanished, navigation screens went black, comms went dead. The 12 corvettes, which had been screaming towards the Erebus on a full-blown attack run, were suddenly just dead in the water, powerless hunks of metal drifting on their own momentum. For the crews inside, the world plunged into total darkness as every light, screen, and indicator blinked out. A second later, emergency lights flickered on, bathing the bridges in a spooky red glow. Life support was still humming along, but that was it. The enemy crews were in a panic. Officers were barking orders that no one could follow. Engineers ripped open panels, trying to force a manual restart, but nothing worked. The strange part was, the ships weren't damaged at all. The hardware was fine, but every piece of software, every single line of code that ran their ships had been wiped clean and replaced with just one simple command. Stop. They floated like that for 60 seconds, a full minute of helpless silence, giving the crews of 12 advanced warships plenty of time to think about the massive mistake they'd just made. Then, on the 61st second, everything came back on at once. Lights blazed, engines hummed back to life, and weapon systems rebooted. The ships were perfectly fine, exactly as they were before, with just one tiny change. On every navigation screen, a message now glowed. It was written in their own formal military language, the kind used only between high-ranking commanders. It said, "That was a courtesy." And below it, a second line appeared. There will not be a second one. The 12 warships just hung there in space, their crews staring at the message, nobody daring to move or even breathe. Back on the main station, sensor operators watched in disbelief as the dozen enemy ships sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then slowly, one by one, they turned around and limped back to their fleet at the slowest possible speed, with their weapons cold and their shields down, the universal sign for "we give up." The entire incident was over in less than 3 minutes, but its impact would shake the galaxy. Within the hour, the officers who ordered the attack were arrested. Their leader was forced to issue a formal public apology to the humans, an act that was clearly painful for her, but the alternative was much, much worse. The Sci-Fi were a proud people, but they weren't stupid. That chilling message from the Erebus. "That was a courtesy. There will not be a second one," spread like wildfire. It was translated into every language and debated by every government. Within a week, it became the most famous sentence in galactic history. Not because it was a threat. Threats were cheap. It became famous for what it proved. In less than a second, the humans had disabled 12 warships at the same time. They had cracked military-grade encryption, bypassed every firewall, and taken complete control of their enemies' ships. And then, just as easily, they'd turned everything back on without leaving a scratch. This wasn't a weapon. This was something far scarier: total control. The humans had just shown the galaxy that they could reach into any ship in the fleet and turn it off like a lamp. They could do it instantly, effortlessly, and without causing any harm. The unspoken message was terrifyingly clear. If they could turn a ship off harmlessly, they could just as easily turn it off while, say, overloading the core. They just chose not to. It was the most perfect demonstration of mercy and power the galaxy had ever seen. 3 weeks later, a diplomat named Iron received an invitation. It came through official channels, sealed with the emblem of the Terran Commonwealth, and was written perfectly in his native language. Captain Ashcraft herself was personally inviting him to tour the Erebus. Iron accepted without a moment's hesitation. This was exactly what he'd been hoping for. He had spent the last 3 weeks digging up everything he could on humanity, and the more he learned, the more he needed to see them for himself. Not just their ship or their tech, he needed to see them. He took a shuttle over to the Erebus with a single aide. They docked in a civilian bay so enormous you could have fit a small town inside it. Iron stepped out and just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The bay was buzzing with activity. Human crew members were everywhere, some in groups, some alone, carrying tools, pushing carts, laughing and chatting. A maintenance crew was working on a line of ground vehicles. A group of kids, actual children, ran past him, chasing each other and squealing with laughter. One of them bumped right into his leg, looked up with huge eyes, and squeaked, "Sorry, mister," before running off to join his friends. Iron just stared. There were children on this warship. Captain Ashcraft met him at the entrance. She wasn't wearing her formal uniform anymore. Instead, she had on the standard ship-wide clothes: dark pants, a fitted jacket, and boots that looked like they'd seen their fair share of work. She seemed younger up close, or maybe older. It was always hard to tell with humans. "Liaison Iron," she said, offering her hand. He'd read about this human custom and took her hand in his. Her skin was strangely warm against his own cool fingers, and her grip was strong. "Captain Ashcraft, thank you for inviting me." "Thanks for coming," she replied. Most of the other delegates said no. I think our ship still makes them a little nervous. "Oh, I'm nervous too," Iron admitted honestly. "But I'm more curious than I am scared. And curiosity has always served me better." She smiled at that, a real, genuine smile that lit up her eyes and completely changed her face. The cold, stone-faced woman from the diplomatic chamber was gone. In her place was just a person who looked tired and warm and very much alive. She gave him the tour personally. For hours they walked the corridors of the Erebus, and Iron saw a side of humanity no alien ever had. He saw the engineering deck, where giant conduits pulsed with so much energy you could see the heat shimmering in the air. He saw the weapon bays, where devices that could shatter planets sat silent and cold, tended to by technicians who handled them with the casual ease of a carpenter holding a hammer. He saw labs where scientists were studying everything from quantum mechanics to alien plants, their desks a chaotic mess of equipment, notes, and empty coffee cups. He saw the living quarters, where people lived in apartments that looked like they could be on any world. He saw a woman on her balcony, tending to a small garden of tomatoes growing under an artificial sun. He saw an old man sitting on a park bench, reading a book made of actual paper, a technology so ancient it belonged in a museum. He saw 2 teenagers arguing passionately about music in a hallway. He saw a cafeteria packed with hundreds of crew members, eating dozens of different kinds of food. He smelled spices he'd never encountered and heard laughter he didn't need to understand to appreciate. As they walked by, a group of engineers waved at Captain Ashcraft. She waved back, and one of them yelled something that made her roll her eyes and shake her head, but she was still smiling. It hit him then. These weren't conquerors. They weren't warriors. They were just people. Ordinary, messy, complicated, wonderful people who just happened to live inside the most powerful weapon the galaxy had ever known. Erin finally understood why Ashcraft had walked into that chamber all by herself. It wasn't just to be brave or to intimidate everyone. It was because she was a symbol. She was one person, representing her entire species, carrying that incredible weight on her shoulders. She walked that long path because that's what humans did. They carried impossible burdens to impossible places simply because someone had to, and they had decided that someone would be them. At the end of the tour, Ashcraft took Erin to an observation lounge at the very front of the ship. The room had a massive window stretching 30 meters from floor to ceiling, looking out into space. In the distance, the station was a tiny jewel of light, and the mighty alien fleet was just a sprinkle of dots around it. From here, from inside the Erebus, they all looked so very small. They just stood there together, watching the stars in a comfortable silence. Erin gazed at the star-dusted canvas of space, his mind reeling from everything he'd witnessed. "Captain," he began, his voice soft, "if I may ask, were you terrified when you walked into that chamber, all by yourself?" She didn't reply right away. Her eyes were fixed on the viewport, the distant stars swimming in their reflection. For a fleeting moment, she looked like someone perched on the edge of a dizzying cliff, remembering the gut-wrenching feeling of looking down. "Every single second," she finally admitted. "So why did you go through with it?" She turned to him, and that smile returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't the polished smile of a diplomat or the welcoming smile of a host. It was the grin of someone who had stared down the absolute worst thing imaginable and had somehow walked away, bruised and trembling, but still on their feet. "Because that's what we humans do," she said. "We barge into rooms where we don't belong, and we make them our own." Erin SV studied her for a long moment. He recalled the data he'd reviewed, the entire history of a species that had scraped its way out of the mud of a lethal world and reached for the stars. They fought for every inch, lost millions, and yet they never, ever quit. He thought of that chamber, of the single shadow that moved across its floor. He pictured the 12 derelict ships, silent tombs drifting in space, and the one message that sparked them back to life. It was then that he finally grasped the most frightening thing about humanity. They are never as scared as they ought to be, and everything they had ever built, every ship, every city, every single triumph and wonder, was forged not in spite of their fear, but because of it. Fear was never their weakness. Fear was their fuel. They burned it hot and bright like the star powering their impossible ship, and it propelled them ever onward, always pushing into the darkness. He gave a slow nod and turned back to the view screen. The galaxy unfolded before them, immense and ancient, teeming with species that had navigated the stars for millennia. And somewhere out there, on a tiny blue marble orbiting a plain yellow sun, a species that had no business surviving had decided to join the party anyway. The captain spoke quietly. "You know, I think you were worth getting to know." Ashcraft laughed. It was a genuine laugh, a sudden, bright, warm sound that bounced off the viewport and filled the observation deck with a noise that was purely and beautifully human. "You too, liaison," she replied. "You too." For a while longer, they stood there together by the window, the alien and the human, just looking out at the cosmos. Behind them, the ship, the Erebus, hummed with the quiet, vibrant energy of 80,000 lives being lived. Ahead of them, the galaxy waited, full of questions no one had thought to ask, and answers that were yet to be found. In the centuries to come, historians from 100 different species would debate the exact moment the galaxy was changed forever. Some would point to the day the Erebus arrived. others to the vote. A few would cite the 12 dead ships and the message that resurrected them. But the ones who were actually in the chamber that day knew the real story. Everything changed the instant one shadow crept across the floor. Calm, unprotected, and fearless. It was then the galaxy learned that the most dangerous weapon in the universe wasn't a warship 37 kilometers long. It was the species that built it and then sent one woman to speak for them all. A single shadow crossed the room, and the stars were never silent again.